Please tell us, educate us, what is Tavistock? Because I think we've heard about it a lot.
Well, I mean, essentially what it officially is a charitable organisation, and it's connected to the British Psychological Institute, and it is the establishment of psychological and social psychological studies within England. I mean, essentially it is a charity organisation, but it's actually financed by the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the British Home Office, and then there's a lot of sort of anonymous grants that we don't know where they come from, but we assume that they come from businesses like large blue chip companies and stuff like that. I mean, essentially the Tavistock Institute, what it also appears to be interested in is social control and applying these social psychology methods to entire societies to try and basically continue the status quo and to stop people from deviating from established norms and such like that. I mean, it started in 1921 technically, but before that, there was it was called to do with it was set up by a bloke called Hugh Crichton Miller, and he was dealing with shell-shocked soldiers that had come home from the First World War and were in sort of catatonic states and stuff like that. Now, ostensibly, him and people like William Sargent, who was working at St Thomas's Hospital in London, were studying these people to see how they could make them better, but actually what they were doing they were studying at what point the human psyche will snap. They're talking about trauma-based mind control, the fact where you can impose such a hefty trauma onto the ego of a person that it shatters and they become a completely malleable person. Essentially, it's like a synthetic schizophrenia where the outer sort of controls of society, the superego, if you will, it basically dominates the ego and turns the person into a robot. I mean, a lot of this is to do with the concept of problem, reaction, solution. You know, presenting the problem and then providing the problem from an authoritarian standpoint. I mean, the first director of the Tavistock Institute, which was the psychological standpoint, was John Rawlings Rees, and now he was dealing with shell shock soldiers and stuff like that. One of the things that he also did was he was the person that interviewed Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess, when he flew to Britain trying to basically negotiate a truce and an end to the Second World War, he landed at the Marquis of Tavistock's grounds, and what the Marquis of Tavistock did was he turned him over to John Rawlings Rees, who was the director of the Tavistock Institute at that time. Now, we know from Rudolf Hess's diaries from the time that basically John Rawlings Rees was employing all sorts of very bizarre techniques. He was essentially accused of trying to poison him, and he was accused of trying to mesmerize him. And mesmerism, the medical term for hypnosis. And so what we can see as early as 1941 is members of the Tavistock Institute using the mind control techniques that would later become the stalwarts of the MK Ultra and various other things, which is essentially poisoning, isolation, and the use of certain drugs and hypnosis. Now, what's strange is that all of these techniques, they can be tracked back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, for sort of getting initiates into the mystery religions, there were certain processes that had to be used, including chants, isolation, trauma, terror, and basically making the new initiate more malleable. What's interesting about that is that John Rawlings Rees called his collection of psychiatrists and sociologists an invisible college, which is a term that directly correlates to these mystery religions of Egypt. And also, they basically felt that by causing chaos in society, authoritarian people can come in and actually direct swathes of the population for their own betterment, which is exactly like the Freemasonic maxim, order out of chaos. Now, the thing is that Tavistock grew out of Wellington House and Crewe House. Now, what they were the propaganda houses that basically convinced people to go to war against Germany. They were the people that quantified Kaiser Wilhelm as the butcher of Berlin and talked about Belgians being raped and Belgian children being having their arms and legs cut off and stuff like that. And so they were also tied directly into like the Daily Mail and the Times and stuff like that through people like Lord Northcliffe, who owned these papers. They were like the Rupert Murdochs of their day. So right from the inception, even before, we can see that the connection with the blue chip organisations, the media, and essentially governmental organisations. Now, what John Rawlings Rees called his psychologists as well was shock troops, and he felt that the function of the shock troop was to go out there and to basically spread the ideology and the social mores of the Tavistock Institute. were Walter Lippmann, who wrote Public Opinion and the Manufacturing of Consent, which we spoke about previously, and Edward Bernays, who wrote Propaganda. He's the founder of Public Relations, and he wrote Engineering Consent, which is, again, it's the concept of basically manufacturing the consent of the general public to accept things that are imposed on them from. One of the things that came out of Wellington House and Crewe House and was down to Lippmann and Bernays was this concept of changing words. For example, we don't have civilian deaths anymore. We have collateral damage. We don't have we don't go in there and overthrow. We have a regime change. And the other one that they came up with was isolationists. Now, this was basically bandied around as a derogatory term for any American that felt that it was a bad thing to enter into the war. I think Henry Ford was called an isolationist at once, but basically this was a way of frightening people into conformity. Now, in 1932, a bloke called Kurt Lewin took over as director of the Tavistock Institute. He was directly from the Frankfurt School, which is in Germany, which is where you get this sort of concept of cultural Marxism and stuff like that. And he was also connected to the OSS. He was one of the founder members of the OSS, which came from the SS and went on to be the CIA. So we can see that all these seemingly distinct entities, the CIA, the Nazi Party, the Frankfurt School, which is essentially communist, and all these institutions are actually connected through British intelligence. Now, Kurt Lewin basically felt that you should reduce society to a childlike state that he called fluidity by imposing traumatic shocks from an outside point. And basically, by imposing trauma, you reduce the thinking capacity of the subjects of the population, and then you can come in and suggest things. You know, often they'll go running towards the authorities, as we've seen in false flags and stuff like that, saying, please protect us from this seemingly outside a concept called future shock. And the concept of future shock, it was actually written in a book in 1970 by Alf Toffler, this concept of sensory overload and the fact that there's too much change happening in society far too quickly. And this is where basically we get the destruction of ego and the manipulation of swathes of population into more malleable ways. Now, I mentioned before these shock troops and such like that. One of the things that Kurt Lewin did as a shock troop was he basically went out there and spread the Tavistock credos by setting up the National Institute of Mental Health, Esalen, Harvard Business School, MIT, the RAND Organization, SRI, Wharton School of Economics. So again, we've got these right-wing, left-wing, middle-of-the-road groups, sensitivity training and stuff like that. This is all coming from a Tavistock thing. Eric Trist in 1965, who was then the head of Tavistock, said that their job was to create social turbulence, which was basically so that populations could be controlled without their knowledge. And he said in 1965 that thanks to Tavistock, the world was already in an irreversible state of social turbulence. I mean, this is the thing that, like, Tavistock, one of the things that they did during the Second World War, Tavistock were the people that initiated the concept of carpet bombing civilians to cause terror in civilian populations to then get them to want to stop fighting. And they actually, through the RAF strategic bombing campaign and Robert Harris, they actually bombed Freiburg about 8 weeks before Germans responded like for like in England. And this was a purposeful tactic of the Tavistock. I mean, this was later used in America as the Phoenix program, so in Vietnam by the Americans as the Phoenix program, which was again a population, it was a campaign to terrorize the civilian population and therefore cause the reduction of morale in the entire nation state. Now, one of the things that basically one of the things that they do nowadays is they are involved in business training and training for world leaders, teaching them to be more effective sort of people. One of the things that you or some of the people who are watching might have sort of encountered is if you've ever been had a team building exercise at work, or you've had a group building exercise at work, or anything like that, that's a Tavistock implementation. This concept of sensitivity training and bringing people into it's Malthusian in a sense, because basically you're taking people and saying you're an important cog in the machine, but that's all you are. You're a cog in the machine, and without the machine, we're pointless. And I guarantee that everybody's gone through this. They'll take you into a small room in the back of the office somewhere, so you've got limited oxygen. It's very dull. It's very long. You're surrounded by morons 9 times out of 10, and often you're made to stand up and stuff like this. And these are all techniques to basically fatigue you mentally and physically so that you then become more malleable. Now, I guarantee that you've seen this as well. One person will stand up and say, this is rubbish, I don't buy any of this, this is nonsense, why are we wasting our time with this? Now, the teacher or the trainer or whatever will then take that person out of the class and go, I'm glad you've got this, because this is what we're actually after. These guys in there, they don't get it. What this is really about is finding people like you, people that can see through the line, read between the lines, see through the sort of veil. You're the person that we're after. But seeing as you're so very clever at this and you figure this out, could you just do us a favour for the good of the rest of the team? Just stay quiet. And essentially by that, you flatter people into conformity, and it's exactly the same thing. I mean, Tavistock's influence is absolutely huge. I mean, I do write about it in my book. I'm just going to quote a tiny, tiny bit here, Morris, because these are the organisations that Tavistock have got official contracts with. So these are the companies that are influenced by Tavistock and have got this quasi-Freemasonic authoritarian trait running through them and running through their training programs. And they are Microsoft, IBM, AT&T, CBS, NBC, ABC, Westinghouse, Halliburton, Alcoa, Shell, BP, Mobil, Exxon, DuPont, Eli Lilly, Nestle, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Bechtel Corp, Hewlett-Packard, New York Stock Exchange, U.S. Government, U.S. Navy, U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Civil Service Commission, Postal Service, FBI, CIA, U.S. Department of Naval Intelligence, Department of Defense, and the US State Department. And basically, so all of these have got the influence of Tavistock running deeply through their organizations. And one of the things as well that Tavistock did, just to sort of like end on this, that you might have seen, is when the story came out in the first Iraq invasion that they were dumping babies onto the cold floor out of the incubators, that turned out to come directly from a public relations company that was directly financed by Tavistock.
You've been a mine of information,